Tom, as always, I love filling in here. First step, so this is recording now?
Yes.
All right. So Tom, I'm gonna say thank you. And actually, the Spirit moves and sometimes the message changes. But we're gonna keep it under 25 minutes, folks, okay? When you hear pastors say the Spirit moves, you're like, oh boy, cancel lunch at 2 o'clock, right? But the prayer for Connor just struck a chord with my heart. And Tom, this is relevant to you. So one of my dear friends, Reed Ferris, when he was a young boy, he had leukemia. And he was sick, and he spent a year at Children's Hospital in Denver, and people didn't know if he'd make it. And they prayed and they prayed and they prayed. And he did recover. And not only did he recover, that little boy was watching, 8 years old. He was watching what the adults were doing, what the nurses, babe, were doing. He was watching. And it affected his heart to such that, flash forward 20 years, and he's a pediatric oncologist. And he devoted his life. And Reed is like as thin as a broomstick, right, babe? And ironically enough, just the heart of a lion. And he was my predecessor at the University of Wyoming's Outdoor Adventure Department as the deputy director. And the deputy director, the title that Reed held and then I held after him, was kind of funny because we all knew the director, great guy, but he just loved to delegate. And the director was like in a GS 13 or 14 position. And deputy planned this series of outdoor events for these students, plan the trips, get the permits, make it happen. Basically everything your S3 shop does, sir. So as deputy, Reed is planning all these trips. And thin as a toothpick, he'd put on these packs and he would take young college students from the University of Wyoming on 10, 12-day backpacking trips in the Wind Rivers, the Tetons, and that was Reed. And perhaps the greatest trust and privilege I ever had was Reed went to work for Doctors Without Borders in Nepal. And it was back in the day, I want to just guess the year to be 2003 or 4. There was a lot going on, Pakistan conflict, all that stuff. And Reed had married his young sweetheart, his young college sweetheart, Alex. And as Reed's leaving for his 6-month deployment, he pulls me aside and says, Chris, you know Alex, we're up in Seattle. She's prone to depression, she's prone to melancholy. I want you to take her out. I want you to keep an eye on her. And I wasn't married to this beautiful bride yet. And 4 years, 4 deployments, and maybe more than 4 arguments, but we weren't yet a sure deal yet. I kept wondering, what are you doing with me, girl? But she hung in there, so. But in that season of in between, Reed said, keep an eye on my bride. And I thought, wow. And Alex is stunning, and she's just charming and wonderful. And Reed says, while I'm gone on the other side of the world, I want you to keep an eye on my woman. And I'll never forget the one date night. Alex was struggling, and I called her up. I'm like, get dressed, we're gonna go out on a date. Pick her up in the car. What are we doing? I said, we're going to buy a Porsche. And she's like, what? And she knows me. I'm driving like a $1,800 Toyota Camry I bought off eBay. And she's like, whatever. But I dressed the part, and we show up at the Porsche dealership. And I said, just play along. And I was like, sir, I'm a military officer, and I'm getting promoted, which was true. It was the automatic promotion where you fog a mirror. As long as you're not sleeping with the admiral's daughter or caught, you're going to get promoted. And she played along and winked, and I told the sales guy, look, we're not buying today, just so you know up front. I'm just here with my bride. We're gonna go to dinner, and we're gonna just take a look at some cars. And you know how car salesmen are. Oh, you gotta drive it, sir, you gotta drive it. And I'm like, really? Really? I knew he was gonna say that. So he crawls in the back seat of this 911 Carrera, whatever it was, if it had a back seat. And we go out to drive it, and going slow, and he's like, you can open it up a little bit. But he didn't know me. And I opened it up. And Alex is just sitting there just laughing, and she is just laughing. And it was a good time. And Reed came back, and they're still together. And she's a lawyer, nonprofit, inner city, doing great stuff. And Reed's probably head of pediatrics right now. But to have that trust, Tom, thanks for your trust with this congregation. I love being here. And that's the point. Nothing more precious than trust. And John was trusted with a message 2,000 years ago. I know, as Tom often does, he told me what he's been in, and he said, hey, I got to go out of town, I got to do some stuff. And if you want to come back and speak, I'd love it. And here's what I've been doing. I've been doing the book of John. And from what I gather, you just wrapped up chapter 7, is that right? Yeah, and if I know Tom is an expositor. that fair? He doesn't rush. He takes time on every word. He doesn't skip the hard passages. He doesn't skip the passages you guys don't want to hear. He doesn't go just with Republican or conservative passages. He puts out some tough ones that push us. So what do we know about John? John is the most different of the four Gospels. New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, they agree more often than not. Matthew, Mark, Luke, they agree. They call them the synoptics, right? And then there's John, and he's just out there on a whole nother plane. And Bible scholars know, so I'm just going to do a quick recap. They know and are very confident John was the last of the Gospels written. The time John covers is between AD 30 and 36. And it is the last few years of Jesus' life. Most scholars believe Jesus was crucified at AD 33. And, that's known. What's in question is when his birth was and how old he was, which was about 33 years old. But at that time, Pontius Pilate, he was in command, if you will, during that season. And we know the story of the crucifixion. And Pontius is like passive, right? Passive. He kind of knows he shouldn't condemn Jesus to die. More than kinda. He sends him off to be flogged. He's like, hopefully that'll satisfy him. They want me to kill this guy, but he tries him. He finds nothing wrong with him. And then Pontius ultimately says, well, what would you have me do with him? And the crowd shouts, crucify him, right? This is Pontius. This is the time that John's writing about. And he says, fine, but the blood's not on my hands. Talk about abdicating leadership and responsibility. So Pontius is in command. And I don't know everything that happened. I'm not that detailed of a historian or that educated, but I know he was removed from command. He was relieved. So the commandant at the time, Tiberius Caesar, fires Pontius. And ironically, isn't it the case, commanders, when you try to cover your own six rather than do what's right, you're going to end up getting 10 times worse. Follow your conscience, do what's right. As Hutch said, let those eagles fly. Do what's right. Own your authority. And that's the time. John, the son of Zebedee, often referred to as the closest of Jesus' disciples. And when he's hanging up on the cross, he looks to John and says, this is your mother. And today's passage that Tom left me with at the beginning of chapter 8 is all about the feminine. It's all about the plight of the woman. In the last 4 or 5, I lost count, of times I've been here, I've intentionally brought my cowboy boots. And today you'll notice I'm not wearing them. And I was pleased to look around and see most of the women are wearing open-toed sandals. And I'm like, yes, nailed it. But often, before I'm comfortable with a community, I'll try to assimilate myself as much as possible. Paul talked about this in Athens, to be all things to all people, but to be for Christ always. So the first few times I came here, I got my cowboy boots that these days I primarily just wear when I'm riding motorcycles, the occasion when I get on a horse. Thanks, Hutch, for 40 days maybe of horse riding in the last few years. That's totally you. Thank you. But no, the last few times I've come, I'm like, I want to be accepted. And at the change of command dinner we had on Thursday night, Dick Burbine, does anybody know who that is? Raise your hand if you know who that is. Oh, he's an amazing guy. And we know you know Hutch.
That's the Bridgeport tribe. This is the Smith Valley.
I understand you guys got your tribes, but Dick is the last surviving member of the last ship that was sunk in World War II with a torpedo. And 94 years old, and his son Joe and Dick live together in Bridgeport, and they're phenomenal. And Smitty's like this world champion boxer, 93, and he's their buddy. And his wife's the principal at the elementary school, if I recall right. This tribe, we're having dinner to send Hutch off right and to welcome Dan and his family. And in comes General Turner. And let me just quickly describe General Turner. And think G.I. Joe with a few more battle scars and about 40 years on him from the cartoons from back then. And Turner walks in a little bit late, and he's got his thumbs hooked, and he's been out riding horses at the pack station, Secret Lake, I think. He's got his cowboy boots on. And Dick and the community immediately, one of the things they said is they see him coming in just covered in dust, in his cowboy boots, him and his bride, Carol. And they're like, I knew the moment I looked at you and saw your cowboy boots, you're one of my people. Those expectations, right? So I wore my boots the last couple times for that reason. Expectations. I don't think General Turner meant to do that. He was just like, I want to get there on time, right? So John, he writes a gospel that Jesus is always defying expectations. Always defying expectations. He's not going to wear what you think he should wear. He's not going to be where you think he should be. He's not going to do what you think he should do. The gospel's full of these tensions, these truths. And the most basic level, and I think I've spoke about this before here, is the gospel and the message of Jesus is mercy and grace on one hand, right? And it's justice and accountability on the other hand. And those two hands don't often hold each other very comfortably. They're in tension. And it's like a magnet. Sometimes they push against each other. But John 1, the very first chapter of John 1, the main theme is, this whole book is belief versus unbelief. And John hits it from the beginning. He says, John chapter 1, revelation of the Word. That's what this is about. He goes, in the beginning, the Word was with God, and God was the Word. And he says, like, these words are important. Conflict happens right in the beginning of John. John moves the moment where Jesus is in the temple, it's called cleansing the temple, to the very end of chapter 1. You guys have already known this. Maybe knowing Tom, this was probably 6 months ago, the way he's very careful. No, that's beautiful. I go to High Sierra Fellowship. Anybody know Pastor Rich LeMay? Phenomenal. But he's been preaching for like 22 years. He's only been through the Bible like 3.5 times. And it's phenomenal because he just takes the time. But John moves this account to the very first chapter, where the other synoptic gospels have Jesus cleansing the temple, where he comes in the temple and he sees what's going on. And he's like, are you kidding me? You've got basically a flea market set up in my Father's house. This is the holy place in Jerusalem. One of the synoptics has Jesus braiding a whip. And I love that the most. I think it's Luke. But he has him braiding a whip. So this isn't an impulsive like snap thing. Jesus is like, all right, it's on. It's time for justice. And he's turning over tables. He says, you've turned my Father's house into a den of robbers. Knock it off. That's the very first chapter of John, where if you take Matthew or Luke, we're hearing about the birth narrative, babies in cradles, softer stuff. And John says, no, we're going to talk about the justice. Not a nice guy Jesus was sometimes. He did what needed to be done. Then we roll over to John chapter 2. Of the 7 miracles recorded in John, 5 are distinctive to John. So 2 of them are also talked about in the other synoptic gospels, but John chapter 2, we got the wedding at Cana, where Jesus' mom is like, hey, JC, they're out of wine. And, forgive me, please. It's Cowboy Church, and I'm barefoot on dust. We don't know how Mary might have told her son. She might have said, hey, knucklehead. He was fully human, right? So we can only imagine. I mean, at 8 years old, one of the Gospels says he just took off without telling his mom. If that ain't human, right? And she's like, where is he? And they're heading out of town, and they have to turn around and go back. And he's like, you should have known I'd have been in church, Mom, right? And she's like, come outside with me, right? So anyway, maybe she said JC. But John chapter 2, his mom Mary says, they're out of wine. He's like, it's not my time. What business is it of mine? Mom tells the servants, do what he tells you to do. What does it have happened? The jars filled up with water. Water turned into wine. Right from the beginning, we see Jesus does things that are not expected. We go on to John chapter 3. Then John captures the exchange with Nicodemus, and Jesus tells him, you must be born again. And Nicodemus is like mega pastor. One of my favorites is Chuck Swindoll out of Dallas. I think it's Plano, actually, but suburb of Dallas, former Marine. Great expositor, right? And he's like got one of these super pastors, right? Chuck Swindoll, David Jeremiah, super pastors, maybe even Billy Graham. And Jesus is telling the super pastor at the time, Nicodemus, like, you got it all wrong. You got to be born again. And Nicodemus is like, what? Like, am I going to go back in my mom's womb? What are you talking about? No, it's being born in the Spirit. You got to be totally transformed. I'm here to deliver the Spirit. You got to be born again. And then, of course, probably the most known verse in the Bible, John 3:16, right? For God so loved the world, you know the rest. But what really moves me is John 3:17. It's the next verse. Totally unexpected. John captures Jesus did not come to condemn the world. He did not come to condemn it. these things in tension. Right from the beginning, John's saying like he's turning over tables, he's braiding whips. You know, there's points in there where Jesus is calling folks brood of vipers and whitewashed tombs. But then on the other hand, John says he did not come to condemn it, but to wake us up and to point to what's right. John chapter 3, verse 17. God did not come into the world. The Word did not become flesh to condemn the world, but to save it. Then John 4. And here we get into one of the most distinctive things about John is his treatment of women. And at the time, women did not have much power or authority. I mean, to say they were disenfranchised is a gross understatement. Somehow, people didn't quite get the message. I'm just going to set this down. That all men were created equal. We still don't get that message, right? We're struggling with that right now, right? Or in Genesis, where it said, God saw that it was not good for man to be alone. It's not good. God sit back and watched Adam. He's like, oh my gosh, this is not going to work out well. This man needs a helper. Leave him by himself. Bad things are going to happen. The women are like, Left for 2 weeks, went on leave. You would not believe what my husband did. My wife was rolling her eyes this morning because I'm looking at buying a Ducati motorcycle, which I've been talking about in DC, and she's like, you've got to be kidding me. I bought a van last night and a Mini Cooper 2 weeks ago, and she's like, you know we're moving in like 5 days, right? It is not good for man to be alone. I love you, babe. 18 years, most gracious woman in the room right there. But no, John 4, it's the woman of Samaria, right? You know it. You studied it probably 3 months ago now. I'm catching up with Tom. Woman at the well. And it's totally unexpected. Jesus is sitting at the well and he tells his 12 followers, he's like, hey, go into town, get supplies. I'm going to hang here. I got some relaxing or something else to do. And the woman comes and he says, hey, will you draw some water for me? And she's like, I'm like a hardcore Republican and you're like a Berkeley liberal Democrat, illegal immigrant from Mexico, Uber mask wearing, like, what? Do you know who I am, right? And she's telling this to Jesus, and that's the modern parallel. It really is. And Jesus is like, well, if you knew who was asking you, you'd probably do it. And they have this exchange, and the woman says, well, I know that one day our ancestors worshipped on this mountain and that mountain, and you know, the gospel is just full of mountains. Mountains are an important thing. And here we are in the mountains, right? But Jesus says, if you knew who I was, and she ultimately says, well, one day the Messiah is going to come. Jesus says, I am he. And in the Gospels, this is one of the earliest recordings. Though it was the last one written, it's all about that time frame, 30 to 36. But it's one of the earliest recordings where Jesus reveals himself to women first. That's not insignificant. On the day of resurrection, it's none of the 12 homies that he had closest to him. It was Mary the prostitute that Jesus reveals himself to. Well, I know there might be some young folks watching. Homies is a term that may not be in use amongst this crowd, but bear with me. But Jesus' special treatment of women, and here he tells the woman at the well, I am he. And he says, go get your husband and we'll talk. And she says, I have no husband. He goes, you're right saying you have no husband. The man you're with now is not your husband. And the last 5 you were with. And she's like, oh snap. He knows. But then out comes this grace. This grace. And he accepts water from her. And he talks about living water, and it's an allusion to the Spirit. And that's chapter 4 of John. And it's the special treatment of women. And you're just reading John, and I love John. I shouldn't say that. I almost never recommend John as the first chapter to read for new Christians, because it's deep, and it's heady, and it's out there. I usually tell folks, start with Mark. It's the shortest. It's concise. Mark was just like, let me just get to the point. Or as we say in the military, bluff, bottom line up front. That's Mark. John says, let me take you on a journey. And he paints this scene, kind of like Hutch would do in his conversations. And it's more artful, and it's deep and heady. And so we're left with the men coming back from town, and they're just blown away. Jesus, what are you doing? That woman, do you know who that woman is? Do you know how she rolls? John chapter 4 finishes up with the healing of the official's son, where we learn that Jesus doesn't have to be there to do miracles. The official comes and says, I got a sick boy, and Jesus is like, done, go on your way. And he's like, what? Trust me, go on your way, go home. And he gets home, and he's told, your son was healed yesterday around noon. He's like, that's right when Jesus was saying done. Then John chapter 5, verse 8, flash forward, Jesus is healing a paralytic at a pool. And he'd been there and he's kind of complaining. He's like, I try to get in the water, but every time everyone gets before me and the waters are all stirred up and I can't do this. And Jesus just says, hey, get up, take your mat, walk. Just right to the point. Just this beautiful justice and mercy combined. And then it really starts getting challenging at the end of John chapter 5, verse 28. He says, do not marvel at this, Jesus says. I hear pages turning. You are good and faithful church attenders that are trying to keep up in the Bible. But the point was to get to chapter 8, verse 1. That's what I'm spending 9 minutes on now. But Jesus says, John chapter 5, verse 28, do not marvel at this. The hour is coming when all who are in tombs will hear. And he says, basically, the dead will rise. Jesus is starting to open the aperture on what's expected. He's like, I'm going to blow your minds here, people. The hour is coming when those who are in the tombs will hear. And those of the faithful of God, those that have been called, those that have been chosen, they will join God. And those that are destined for judgment, they will face the wrath. And that first appears in John chapter 5, verse 28. He went to 6. John chapter 6, Jesus feeds thousands with bread, and then he goes into more challenging stuff and says, I am the bread of life. And even his followers are like, what? And we're getting to these points like where he says some of these famous phrases like, unless you eat my body and my flesh and drink my blood, you cannot be my disciple. And people are like, he's just defying expectations, blowing, like, what? But this is John chapter 6. He feeds thousands. And then he talks about himself being the bread of life. Verse 32 of John chapter 6. Jesus starts to get really deep into the conflict of the Old Testament versus what he's come to bring in the New Testament. And he says, verse 32, it was not Moses that gave you manna. It wasn't Moses. When they were in the desert and they were complaining because they had nothing to eat. And they were like, the people were complaining to Moses, why did you bring us out of Egypt? We were way better off being slaves under Pharaoh. We were way better off than the situation here. We're out in the middle of nowhere. We have no food. We have no water. This sucks. Right? You know it. Moses had a tough job. Sir, your command was tough, but I'm sorry, Moses is like 40 years. You did 2. Just for perspective. Count your blessings. And a grumbling people the whole time. And Moses was like, what? You saw the Red Sea parted. You saw the pillar of fire and smoke. Like, am I crazy or should you just believe we're on the right path? And they're like, well, we'd feel a lot better if we had some bread. Just like, oh, the burden of command, gentlemen. But Jesus says, verse 32, it was not Moses that gave you manna, but my Father. And he's talking about him being the bread of life. And then he goes on and says, like, it was my dad. And people are like, did he just say his dad? Like, that's a bit audacious, right? So this is the context that leads us up to chapter 7, which you just finished. And again, Jesus defying expectations. John chapter 7 is John, the author, is talking about the Feast of Booths. And you don't miss the Feast of Booths. If you're Jew, 2,000 years ago, you don't miss that movement. That's like the Marine Corps ball, and you're an officer. It's non-optional. You're there. And Jesus is telling his followers, yeah, I'm not going to be there. And they're like, what? You're the rabbi. You're the teacher. You're the man we're following. It's like the CO saying, hey, I may not make it up to the GSR at 6 o'clock tomorrow for the ball. I might have something else going on. And the wardroom is like, you have got to be kidding me, sir. Like, you're not going to be there. And if I could just take a pause for a parallel hutch, this is classic you. Defying expectations. Classic. And it's not ungodly. So before you showed up, sir, I shared with the community, we have a Marine who has a spouse in one hospital and a baby in a NICU in another hospital. And it wouldn't surprise me a bit. And I told the folks, it wouldn't surprise me a bit if Hutch is like, I'm on my way, or I'm on the phone, or I'm standing at the Marine's house, or I'm at the bedside crying with the wife, or I'm praising the NICU ICU team for this baby and not where I'm scheduled to be. So Jesus is not going to go to the Festival of Booths, and his 12 followers leave without him, and that's where you guys left off, right? They go to the festival. And they're like, I guess Jesus isn't coming. But Jesus comes incognito, again, defying expectation. They're like, well, he's not going to come. But then all of a sudden he just shows up teaching in a synagogue, and he's saying hard things. And the Pharisees have already determined this guy has broken too many conventions and rules. We are going to relieve him of command. We have the authority. We are the senior pastors, priests, rabbis. We are going to relieve him of command. And they send a delegation to find Jesus. In the beginning of the festival, when everybody's mingling, and they're like, oh yeah, you're here from Quantico. Oh, you're here from 3rd Marines. Oh yeah, you're down up from 29 Palms. And they're doing that at the festival. They're like, hey, where's the commandant? He's not here. Where's Jesus? He's not here. And then he slips in and he gets caught teaching in a remote, maybe obscure synagogue. And this delegation sent to find him during that mingling phase and to bring him back and to arrest him and to hold him to account. They're like, well, I guess he's not here. And so maybe they drop their guard. And they happen to be in this room and Jesus is teaching, and they're just blown away at his authority. They're blown away at the things he's saying. And Jesus is putting out more of this bread of life, I am the way, the truth, all that theology Jesus is putting out. And they let him walk out. And the delegation doesn't arrest him. The delegation goes back and reports to the seniors, and they're like, so he was there. And they're like, yeah, this should have heard the stuff he was teaching. And they're like, this is just some dumb hick from the country, Jesus. Nothing good comes out of Nazareth. He wasn't educated in the classical style. He didn't have the proper seminary credentials. He didn't have the proper alphabet soup behind his name. And they were stunned. It's all good. The Lord calls us to dance. Sometimes we need music. Like John, many of the scholars in the earliest centuries after these Gospels were written marveled at John and Peter, both of those. And if you've read the letters of Peter, the latter end of the New Testament, you know, Peter and John were both just like knuckle-dragging fishermen. They were the guys fixing the John Deere tractor out there at harvest. They were the guys pulling over on the side of the road because they saw your hood up. They weren't Princeton, they weren't Yale, they weren't Harvard. But they wrote these powerful things. And people are like, how could those dudes have written this? And I'll tell you, because they walked. John and Peter, 1 and 2, they were Jesus' closest. And isn't it ironic, Jesus chose people just like you and me? Well, sir, you excluded. You've got a phenomenal education. But somehow yet, I've never seen anyone as educated and as prepared as you for awesome command to be as in touch with the people, as Doug wisely and properly noted. Weep with them, the lowest ones. So that's where we left off. And then we get to a passage that doesn't appear, and here we go. Thanks for bearing with me for the last 18 or so minutes. John chapter 8. This is where Tom left off and said, hey, Chris, this is where I'm going to be. And ironically, the earliest manuscripts of John do not include this passage. And most Bibles will give a little footnote and say, the earliest manuscripts do not include 753 through 811. What does that mean? That means about 1800 years ago, a lot of guys were copying word for word. They're sitting at a table with maybe a candle in the dark and a quill, and they were copying word for word on manuscripts. And there was hundreds of them, maybe thousands. And they went all throughout Syria, Turkey, the Mediterranean, Egypt, Libya. They went all over the place. And when we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, you know, just about 50, 60 years ago now, thousands of earthen pots, they pulled stuff out and they carbon dated it, and they were like, whoa, this stuff is like 1,700 years old. To my knowledge, unless there's been some new archaeological finds, we don't have a first draft of any of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And it calls upon us a slight degree of faith, but not as much as some would think. A slight degree of faith that the Word is trustworthy, that the Word of God is perfect. Not as much as people think. Because when you find 100 copies of the same letter in different locations and they agree with like 98% accuracy, and you know you got these guys up in the middle of the night writing and transcribing, you know it's like, okay, there was something to this. It's more trustworthy and more drafts of Homer's Iliad or Odyssey. But some of the earliest and oldest dated didn't have this message. And it's not surprising to me. Because the convention at the time was not to honor women. The convention at the time, they were powerless. It wasn't to chat with the woman at the well. It wasn't to spend much time with Mary Magdalene. Certainly not to be the first to reveal when you came out of the tomb. Certainly not to have her put perfume on one's feet. And maybe some of the earliest men were like, ooh, this one, you never know. But it survived, and it was captured. And so now we go to it. And I invite you now, please open up your Bibles. John chapter 8, verse 1. And I'm going to read from the ESV. Hutch, I was tempted to go New King James, but we'll do that in D.C., sir. I'll be living 15 miles from you. Good Episcopalian. John chapter 8. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives early in the morning, and he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery. And placing her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now the law of Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. So what do you say?" This they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones. That's significant. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman," I would love to have known the tone and how he said that. I'd love to have a really good Bible scholar here to explain the Hebrew, the Aramaic, the Sanskrit, the Greek. Woman, and the meanings of that word. A really good Bible teacher will spend a lot of time doing word studies. Love to have that skill and that experience. But he says, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on sin no more." The word of God. Praise be to God. Praise be to God that we have one really different writer of the Gospels who captures 5 unique miracles, who has a special and unique focus on women. Boy, do we need it now. Who has a special and unique focus on the divinity of Christ, but also the conflict of Christ, the righteous conflict. The conflict of a woman that on Tuesday nights at 7 is going to be praying for the next 4 months and inviting others. Who in a bit of a scrappy tone, if I may, which is good, saying you don't have to be there to pray. Get with it, people, right? Justice, mercy, and grace. So what the writer doesn't talk about, and for 4 years I was a chaplain recruiter for the Navy, and my job was to go to several different churches on Sundays, listen to pastors, get to know the community, and try to find that diamond in the rough, that person that was ready and willing to go step off an ANRAP in 140-degree heat if need be, and serve people, who had the knowledge, the grit, the fitness, all that stuff. And I've heard this preached so many times in so many good ways. I don't think I've ever had the opportunity to preach much on it. And I know Tom will pick it up because that's what he does. He's he's going to go over it. So that's why I went over the recap, and I'll talk briefly about a few things that stand out for a lot of times when this is preached. What stands out most notably? Where's the man, right? The leaders bring the woman who is caught in adultery. And there's no mention of where the man is. It takes 2, yo. Right? Who's this guy? Who's this guy? And in my theology, women and men are not created equal. As much as I'd like to identify as a petite Asian woman, I'm not. I'm a Clydesdale, and I'm built in a different ways. And my wife compliments me so well. Every way that I'm weak, she's strong. And in my theology, the man owns 51% of the responsibility in this situation. 51%, because God called him to be the leader. Spiritually, morally, ethically. God called Adam first and gave Adam instructions. One rule. Lawyers would have no job if Adam just did what he's supposed to do. One rule. You got all this, Adam, but hey, that tree right there, just leave that one alone and you're good. You had one rule, Adam. And Adam's job was to pass on to Eve and say, hey, God was walking with me in the garden last night. And he just said, hey, one rule. And when Eve messed up, most scholars will go back and say, you know what's missing is a real heartfelt leadership moment of Adam to inspire and convince Eve what right looked like. What's present is his passivity and saying like, well, okay, well, looks good. She had it, so I'll take of it too. And God was like, no, I commissioned you, Adam, you, to inspire and lead. So what's missing here? Where's the guy, right? And that shows up in tons of these messages. What else is missing? No demographical data about this woman caught in adultery. We don't know if she was more along the lines of Mary, Jesus' mom, if she was 14 and they found that she was pregnant. I mean, frankly, it could have been Jesus' mom dragged in for adultery when she started showing, and they said, whoa, she's not married, adultery, let's stone her. Praise be to God, it didn't work out that way for Mary, right? It could have been this righteous, noble young girl who was raped, who was violated morally, ethically, physically. We don't know. Or it could have been someone more along the lines of the woman at the well who had made a number of bad choices, who was, we can presume, after 5 times, she should have probably learned how to get it right, and the husband she was with now wasn't her husband, or the man she was with, right? Or Mary Magdalene. We don't know the demographics. But whatever the case is, they're ready to stone her. I like to imagine when I put myself in the scene, and I know this is dangerous for preachers to do, and you guys all know I've never been a preacher of a church. Why Tom Keats inviting me back? He must know something I don't. But I hope it's because he knows I love the Lord with all my heart, and I've laid down my life to follow him. I hope that's why. I hope it's because he knows that I'm called to love him and love you, and I try to do it. Credentials and experience or not, but here's what I try to imagine that's dangerous for preachers to do this. I try to imagine that she looked up to Jesus when she was being threatened with being stoned, and she had in her eyes, help me, Lord. Because that's what the whole book of John is about. He says, if you trust in him, if you partake of his bread and his wine, his body and his blood, that you will not be condemned. John 3:17, he did not come to condemn the world. I like to imagine that this young woman looked up, or maybe a middle-aged woman, who knows, but this woman looked up with Jesus with eyes that just said, help me, please. I know you can help me. And Jesus says, gotcha. On it. Tracking. Will do. And so Jesus walks around and he's writing on the ground. And the Gospels don't capture this, but I like to imagine he might have been walking up in front. It said the oldest went away first. And I like to imagine he walked up in front of one guy and maybe he said, tax return 2003. He who is without sin, let him cast the first stone. And he walked away and said, that trip in Vegas, 1997, wrote down. And he's talking. Because he knows all. We don't need to open our mouth to pray. It's good that we do, and it's proper that we do, but we don't need to. He knows it. That's what I like to imagine, because he could do anything. And here's what he consistently does. If we lift our eyes to him and say, help me, Lord, I have gotten myself into a mess. Not unlike the thief on the cross, there was 2 others on the cross when Christ was crucified, and one was mocking Jesus. Is anybody doing that these days in our country? A couple folks. And there's the tension and there's the parallel. One was mocking Jesus, and the other thief says, you fool. He looks over at the guy mocking and says, we deserve to be up here. We are getting what we deserve, but this man has done nothing. And he turns to Christ and he says, please remember me. And Christ turns, you recall what he says? I tell you, this day you will be with me in paradise. This day. Audacious grace, audacious mercy. He hadn't been attending churches his whole life, we can presume, the thief on the cross. He hadn't been overflowing the offering dish. He hadn't been serving in Awanas and Boy Scouts and all that other stuff. He was up on a cross, condemned, And he looked at Jesus with longing eyes and trusting eyes and said, he does not deserve to be up here. Please help me. Please remember me. This day you'll be with me. So here we have the end of my discussion about John as a whole and the first part of John chapter 8. That some transcripts left out. What do we leave out? What do you leave out? What part of the story is challenging to you? What part do you not want to hear? After 18 years with my wife, sometimes I want to hear some things, and sometimes I don't want to hear, don't let the sun go down on your anger. I don't want to hear that. I want to hold on to it. I want to be like, it's not fair. Can anybody relate to what I'm saying? Right? But Jesus' mercy and grace is slathered all through John. And the conflict that he says, don't avoid. Don't avoid it in your marriage. Don't avoid it in command, gentlemen. And Hutch, you've done a phenomenal job not avoiding conflict. The way you put yourself out there, sir. And looking around this room and so many wise eyes and old marriages that I've gotten a few nods from, and say, oh yeah, justice and grace. What would Jesus write on the ground in front of you if you were standing by to condemn somebody? So what's the big topic of today, right? COVID. How does it, any good preacher should pull it back into how does this relate to today? What does right look like today? To wear a mask, to not wear a mask. To support Trump, not support Trump. To socially distance, to not. Immigrants. Minorities, people of different skin color. Who are the marginalized today? Who's Jesus going to surprise you with by whom he sits down next to, by whom he asks a drink of water from? If your eyes are open, you'll see. And frankly, both are true. My wife and I are both come from a nursing background, and those of the command know I was the infection control nurse for Naval Hospital Bremerton my first tour. And I defended the infection control practices, and as much as I love Hutch, a few times he's been like, you're a hypocrite, chaps. Because on one side, I'll be like, you all need to do this, wear the mask, we need to shut down everything that's not essential, we need to protect our force, we need to protect this community, get with it. Then a couple days later, I'm saying, rock climbing's not that infectiously loaded. Or right now, I'm saying, a marriage retreat at Lake Tahoe for our Marine families, if done well, if done carefully, the juice could be worth the squeeze. We shouldn't rule this out. And both are true. And so this morning I stopped off at TRE, Dollar General, and as I've done every time I come here, I usually pull over somewhere with my cup of coffee and I sit down in some shady place and I pull out my notes and I say, oh, scratch that, and I pray, and I got on my knees, and then okay, I'm going to add that, scratch that. And I noticed a Subaru, and maybe you guys know who this guy is. His name's Jeff. And it's lifted up, and it's got these red roll bars and cages all around it, and a brush guard, and the Subaru looks like a monster truck. And I've actually been out motorcycle riding in the Pine Nuts in the last 3 years, and I've seen this guy come ripping over a hill, and I've been like, what is that? Monster truck Subaru. And as I get out to go into the Dollar General store and had a nice soda as I sat there and worked on my notes, I walked to the front door, and just as I do now, I had my mask in my pocket. Had some money too, but mask in the pocket. And before I had it out of my pocket, this lady steps out of Dollar General, and she's like, you cannot come in our store without a mask. And I just smiled, and I was like, God bless you, sister. That's what right looks like. That's the conflict of John chapter 1. You do not come into my house unless you respect the threat that's out there. Where's your mask? Right here, ma'am. Proceed. Then all of a sudden, she was just lovely. But out in the parking lot, in that Subaru sat Jeff. And I come out of the store, and I got my business, and I was like, hey, how you doing? What's your name again? I've met you before, Jeff, blah, blah. And he's got his bride there, and he looks a little dismayed. What's going on? What's wrong? We don't have a mask. He's sitting there because he doesn't have a mask, and the guard is not letting him in at the Dollar General in TRE. And I love it, and I love it. And she's right. My sister works at Dollar General in Texas. My dad was in the ICU and nearly died for 2 weeks. My sister works at Dollar General. My dad barely made it, 77 years old, 1st Cavalry, Vietnam vet, combat veteran. I'm so glad he's still here because my sister is scrappy and fought. My mom's best sister didn't make it. We buried her a few months ago. Respiratory failure, Las Vegas. So Jeff's sitting in the parking lot, and rightly so. Come on, man, 4 months, where's your mask? But justice, mercy, and grace. I look at Jeff, I got you, brother. Go to my car, pull out my mask, walk over to him. Oh, thank you. Keep it, you're good. And he goes in and he does his business. And I finished my few notes and I came here. And now I'm not a man of my word. I'm at like 34 minutes. I said 25. I hope it's been worth it. Tom, I love you. Thank you for trusting me with your bride. I love coming here to Cowboy Church, Smith Valley. Colonel Whitnam, sir, Dan, this probably won't be the right church for your girls. And I'll have you guys know, the first phone call I had with Dan, Colonel Whitnam, he was at Quantico, Training Education Command, sir. Yeah, 40 minutes on the phone at the flagpole with the 3 and 4 stars, with the Commandant walking down his halls. Talks to the lowest ranking chaplain out there. Hey, chaps, mountain warfare. Few things. I want you to know the churches I come from. I want you to research this one in Camp Pendleton that was really special to my wife and I, and the one we're at now. And I'm gonna need some recommendations. I'm gonna need to get my kids into a youth program. First conversation, sir. You're starting off well. And the time he invested from the beginning. That's your new commanding officer up here for the next couple years. And not unlike Hutch, who spent hours the first week or two with me back 2 years ago. Chaps, I need prayer about lots of stuff. Like, wow, this is gonna be tough, right? And that's how he started. And that's how Jim Donnellan was before him. And so aren't we blessed that God has seen fit to send 3 Christian messengers to run this base up here, right? That were raised by wonderful Christian women, Titus women. If you haven't read that book lately, you want to read about scrappy women, Ruth, Naomi, Hannah, 1 Samuel, Titus. So, sir, this may not be the church for your kiddos because their youth program is a little wanting. But, sir, I implore you to come back, maybe quarterly, miss your service up in Carson City or wherever you end up landing, Gardnerville, because this is the salt of the earth here. This is where you will find the heart and soul of Carson and Antelope Valley, right here. And if I was not moving on to DC, there's no other place I would say yes to first than preaching here. You guys are the heartland. God has a mission for you. Keep fighting the big and important fights. Don't stray from conflict. Don't be passive, but do it in grace. Do it in grace and justice. If you spend time in the Word and time in prayer, and in the quiet, your eyes are lifting up to Jesus and saying, Lord, help me here. He is faithful to help you, as he's helped me. When I first got here, never been with a Marine Corps unit, and I'm in an 04 billet that's 1 grade above me. No FMF pin, no infantry experience, and the Marine Corps only sends their best and scrappiest. And I was terrified 3 years ago, Friday. I am not worthy to be here. And God said, did I not call you? Back to Moses in the burning bush, the argument in Exodus chapter 3. And he's like, you got the wrong guy, I'm not eloquent. God's like, shut up, I got you. I got you. Just keep your eyes on me. I'll write in the sand when I need to. People will drop stones. It's gonna be okay. Please pray with me. Heavenly Father, thank you for the privilege and for Tom that trusts me. And Father, for traveling mercies for him, that he might find rest in those places. For this humble man, Tom, who's run this church, him and his wife and his bride, his sacrifices that they've made to answer your call, in spite of so many more lucrative opportunities he had in his life, he came here as he was directed and has served faithfully. And to be able to care for his bride is amongst the greatest honors and privileges, and I thank you. And I pray you're filling up his tank right now, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, to keep bringing your word, to be receptive to your spirit that might change his message at the 11th hour the night before. or in the pre-dawn, the day of. May he bring just what he's to bring to these people. Always your word, always your spirit, always your son. Be with these, my friends, in Jesus' name. Until we meet again, amen. Thank you, family.
Let's all stand for our closing song, Give Thanks. Give thanks with a grateful heart. Give thanks to the Holy One. Give thanks because he's given Jesus Christ, his Son. Give thanks with a grateful heart. Give thanks to the Holy One. Give thanks because he's given Jesus Christ, his Son. And now let the weak say, I am strong. Let the poor say, I am rich because of what the Lord has done for us. And now let the weak say, I am strong. Let the poor say, I am rich because of what the Lord has done for us. Give thanks. We give thanks. We give thanks.
Gracious God, as we give thanks, we also invite and implore your wisdom in our lives. Father, protect this congregation as the pandemic is spreading. It's gotten worse. It's gotten much worse in our state. I pray that you protect this group, that you put your hedge and your halo around this barn, around each house. And Father, give us the wisdom and discernment to know when to listen to that clerk at Dollar General. Get our mask. Take due diligence. May we work like the outcome depends completely on us and pray like it depends solely on you. Finally, Father, I thank you for our visitors, for our new CO. We say goodbye to Colonel Hutch that you sent in your spirit. Micah 6:8, you instructed us, what does the Lord require? I thank you for a man who's walked with humility, who's done justice, and been filled with grace. So Father, on this day as we go forth, may we be transformed by your word, by the encouragement, edification, and challenge of each other, all with love, all with the purposes in mind to be lights to the world. In Jesus' name, amen. Now go in peace. May the God's grace, may his countenance be with you. May his favor be for you all days.